All right. Good afternoon, everyone. If you are just joining us, my name is Whitney Owens, and I'm Chief Learning Officer for Cincinnati Museum Center. And I'm here with Dr. Kimberly Hamlin for a Q&A on women's suffrage. I am so excited to be with you today, of all days. As some of you may know, today is a hugely significant one, when the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified 100 years ago and officially granted women right to vote. We're hosting this Q&A to complement a new exhibition, a free exhibition that just opened at Cincinnati Museum Center. It's called An Unfinished Revolution, Women and the Vote, which examines the ways in which the 19th Amendment increased but did not fully solve US women's right to vote. One quick housekeeping note for viewers. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a button that says Ask a Question. Please definitely use that to share any burning queries, and we'll get to as many as we can during our hour together today. I am so pleased to be joined by Dr. Kimberly A. Hamlin, who is an award-winning historian, author, and professor specializing in the history of women, gender, and sex in the United States. Her most recent book is called Free Thinker: Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, which centers both sex and race in the history of women's rights, yes, see it behind you, and in the long struggle for the vote. This book has received both the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award and the Carrie Chapman Catt Award for Research on Women in Politics. Dr. Hamlin is a regular contributor to media outlets, including the Washington Post, NPR, CBC Radio, and Vice. She graduated from Georgetown University and received her PhD in American Studies from University of Texas. Hamlin has worked on several public history projects focused on women and contributed to various PBS documentaries. And we're lucky to have her living here in Cincinnati, Ohio with her family, where she co-hosts the Mercantile Library's Women You Should Know book series. Shout out to our friends at the Mercantile. And she also teaches at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Shout out to our Miami family, being the product of a Miami merger. I am Dr. Hamlin, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Whitney. I'm just so excited to be here and so excited to be marking the centennial with the interactive Q&A. This is really great. Thank you.
Excellent. Wow, and happy Ratification Day. So let's start off with a basic question. What happened on this day 100 years ago?
On this day 100 years ago, all the forces for and against suffrage converged in Nashville, Tennessee, and they voted during a special ratification session, which was a hard-fought victory even of itself to get the ratification session called. And the gentlemen in the Tennessee legislature were pretty much against the amendment with a small majority until the very last minute when, as most of you probably know by now, young legislator Harry Burns switched his vote from a no to a yes, marking the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And the reason that women so desperately wanted the amendment to be ratified by August is so that they could vote in the 1920 presidential elections.
Excellent. Well, as you know well, women's history is not always taught as fully as other histories in school. And so for those viewers who may not have learned about the suffrage in their high school history classes, could you walk us through some of the high points of the fight for women's suffrage?
Yes, I'm so glad you've asked me this because this is really my passion in life. And one of my pet peeves, I guess, to put it mildly, is the short shrift that women get in our high school history textbooks, in our state standards, even today. So just to give one example, if you want to Google it later, in 2017, the National Women's History Museum conducted a study to see how are women presented in our nation's history textbooks. And even now, after generations of pioneering scholarship about women, even now, women are still sidebar status and women of color are specifically underrepresented. So I'm really glad you've asked this, and I'm glad for the opportunity to share some of the highlights that may not be included in our textbooks or our state standards. So we often think of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 as really the origins of the women's rights movement, but that's not quite true. The women's rights movement really began in abolition. So women who fought for abolition, both Black and white, in the 1830s, 1840s, begin to make arguments on behalf of women's rights, as well as those of enslaved people. So it was not a far step for women like the Grimke sisters, for anti-slavery speakers like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was an African-American woman, to see the links between women and enslaved people, right? And to also understand that if you're going to talk about the rights of the enslaved, you also need to talk about the rights of women, because so many enslaved people obviously were also women. So the origins of women's rights are the abolition movement of the 1830s, 1840s. Yes, women and men did convene in Seneca Falls in 1848, but that too would not have been possible without the abolition movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her co-conspirator, if you will, Lucretia Mott, had met through the abolitionist movement. They hatched their plan for the Seneca Falls Convention in 1840 at the London World Anti-Slavery Convention, where Stanton had gone on her honeymoon, as you do. So at the abolition convention, Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided that because they had been relegated to the balcony and not allowed to speak, that what they needed was a convention specifically for women's rights. So I want to really highlight here that the women's rights movement emerges out of abolition. So the first chapter of this story then is the fight for what was called universal suffrage, one for all for one, meaning reformers of the abolition movement also fought for women's rights, and they were largely one and the same group up until the Civil War. The Civil War, and more specifically, the debates over this Reconstruction Amendments, 14th and 15th Amendments, splinter this universal rights coalition. What happens is that the 15th Amendment gets ratified in 1870, so 2020 is also the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, but the 15th Amendment enfranchises Black men, but it doesn't say anything about women. So the Universal Rights Coalition debate this. Should we support the 15th Amendment, even though it doesn't include women, or should we not? And if you are a constitutional lawyer, you know the 15th Amendment doesn't say anything about sex, but because it's building on the 14th, it was implied as only pertaining to men. So this splinters the Universal Rights Coalition. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony go one way, their other colleagues go another, and support the 15th Amendment. Stanton and Anthony decide that what they need to do is fight for women's rights in a separate federal amendment that enfranchises women. So the 19th Amendment began as the 16th Amendment, the sort of twin of the 15th. The next milestone I want to point out, because it's in the news today, and I'm skipping over many interesting things, but you may have seen that Susan B. Anthony, that President Trump has proposed pardoning Susan B. Anthony for voting in the 1872 election today. So what was going on in 1872 is that suffragists began to argue that really women were enfranchised already under the 14th and 15th Amendments. Suffragists argued in this legal strategy known as the New Departure that if you read the 14th and 15th Amendments together, you could argue that citizenship equals voting rights, that all citizens are entitled to the vote. So Susan B. Anthony, along with many other women, tested this strategy in the 1872 elections. Susan B. Anthony's case had a technicality, so she wasn't able to appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. Virginia Minor of Missouri was. So the Supreme Court case that decides this is Minor v. Hepperset in 1875. The Supreme Court rules that citizenship does not equal voting rights. And so this is the end of the New Departure strategy. And I'm foregrounding this here because I think our conversation is ultimately going to end up with where are we today? So I want to start here with this notion, this important fact that citizenship does not equal voting rights, that there is no voting rights guarantee for citizens. The next sort of phase of the suffrage movement begins in the 1890s when these rival factions from the 15th Amendment reunite to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And when they also join forces with the much, I can't stress how much more, with the much larger Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. So the Nassau merger, together with joining forces with the Temperance Union, it's the beginning of suffrage becoming more mainstream, more acceptable, more something that regular, traditional, conservative, even middle-class ladies will do. Before then, it's radical, it's fringe, it's a teeny movement. Then in the 20th century, so momentum is growing. In the 20th century, the next couple events I want to highlight is when the federal amendment becomes a really tangible, seemingly achievable goal. That starts to happen in the teens. Before then, suffragists debated whether or not they should go state by state by state by state or federal amendment. The state by state method was, as you can think about the labor entailed of going state by state, every state legislature with every varying rule. Some states demanded that to change the constitutions, you had to pass the ballot measure twice. So just imagine the labor that women did in these state by state campaigns. But the reason they appealed is that they left the question off the table of Black women voting in the South. If you go state by state, you don't have to talk about or fight for the rights of Black women to vote in the South. The federal amendment makes that issue paramount. Why? Because to get a federal amendment passed Congress, you need 2/3 of the vote and then 3/4 of the states, or at that time, 36. So you're going to need some Southern support. So that's why the suffragists so long to really rally behind the federal amendment. What makes the federal amendment the issue of the day in the teens is a variety of factors, one of which is the increase of numerically the number of women going to college, and also the increase of women going to college engaging in suffrage work. So this revitalizes the movement. A woman named Maud Wood Park, who we may talk more about later, founded the College Equal Suffrage League while she was at Radcliffe. And then the woman that most of us have heard of, Alice Paul, who as a young college graduate went to London and was radicalized by her time among the more militant British suffragists, came back to the United States in 1912. She went to the Nassau Annual Convention that February, and she said, you know what, ladies, I'm done with the letter writing. I'm done with the petitions. We need to take this to the streets. We are going to demand the federal amendment, and we're going to demand it now. So the first thing she does, along with Helen Hamilton Gardner, whose biography I've just written, they were teammates on this project, is plan the 1913 suffrage parade to coincide with the first inauguration of Woodrow Wilson in March 1913. This is the largest, until 2017, the largest women's march in US history. It is also the first time that the suffrage movement garners positive national attention, not mocking, not divisive, not derisive, but positive national media attention throughout the country. And it also really reinvigorates the suffrage movement. It makes them think, oh, you know what, maybe we can do this. The next milestone I'll touch on before going to our next question is Carrie Chapman Catt's ascendancy to the presidency of Nassau. She had been president in an earlier phase of suffrage work, but she was really frustrated by the lack of organization of Nassau and by the group's slowness to embrace the federal amendment. So she turns to international work. Then she comes back in 1915 and says, okay, ladies, I will agree to be Nassau president, but only if you pledge to me. She asked this of the Nassau board and of every state president. She said, only if you pledge to me that we are going to go wholly in on the federal amendment. She said, we've never even really tried that hard for the federal amendment. Let's see what happens when we do. So she put together this brilliant political strategy known as her winning plan, where she plotted out, congressional district by congressional district, vote by vote, plan by plan, what precisely women would need to do, not just to get the amendment through Congress, but then immediately to turn to ratification. So that's the other milestone I want to point out today. I could talk about so many more, but that's a brief timeline for us to begin with.
That's great. And I'm curious. I mean, I'm impressed by it. Sounds like throughout the movement, women have just been really focused on getting it done and trying all kinds of strategies, whether it's arguing that laws already passed apply to them, going state by state, focusing on the federal amendment, and really trying a number of ways and just constantly innovating to figure out, how to get to their goal. In Carrie Chapman Catt's winning plan, what were some of the strategies she used to bring the states on board, state by state, legislator by legislator?
So, well, first she just needed all of the states to agree to her plan and to not do their own state by state plan at the same time. So that was also her way of saying, ladies, because some of the women who lived in states in the West where they knew they had a pretty good chance of getting the amendment passed, they wanted the support of the federal organization. And also it was her way of telling the Southern states to shut down. She was basically also saying, we're not going to support these, white supremacist state ballot measures in the South. I need all you Southern ladies in on the federal amendment. So this also prompts another sort of internecine rift where some Southern chapters of Nassau did leave and say, you know what, no, we cannot support the federal amendment because we cannot support enfranchising, even if only on paper, Black women in the South. So that was also what Carrie Chapman Catt was saying. But she also was talking about the mobilization of her troops. So Nassau had been well organized on a federated strategy, county by county, or at least city by city, that then reported to the state chapters that then reported to the federal. So she was also issuing a call saying, she had said in an earlier speech, like, you have plenty of suffrage members, but basically everyone thinks that suffrage one day will happen. They don't stop to think like, oh, what do I have to do today to get suffrage to happen? So she was also saying, ladies, now is the time. Now is when you are calling your representatives. Now is when you're going to their office. Now is our full bore effort. So that was other part of her strategy, is we can't just think about this anymore. We need to put it into action.
I love it. Don't wait for the inevitability of history or assume that it's going to happen. Go out there and, move your feet, pray with your feet, as John Lewis would say. So the suffrage movement is often described as a racially divided movement. Why? And you touched on this a little bit, but what role did race play in the women's right for vote?
It is one of these central themes and stories of the women's rights movement culminating in the vote. So I mentioned earlier that the first rift was the breakdown of the Universal Suffrage Coalition. So that's the first time where we see women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton articulating that they believe that white women, have priority and that they should be voting first. But this comes into play throughout the movement in a variety of ways. So we talked about also the role of race in debates about the state by state strategy versus the federal strategy. So that's another factor. The other way it plays out is just in personnel, right? Who can join the suffrage group? So as the wonderful historian Martha Jones has recently written, every time you say suffrage, you're basically saying white, because the mainstream suffrage groups didn't have any Black officers. Not all of them were technically segregated, but most of them were at least de facto segregated. So Nassau, for example, I mentioned they were a federated group, so each chapter could decide their own memberships, but that too in some ways was a capitulation to Southern racism and letting Southern chapters of Nassau not have Black members. But it was rare even in Northern chapters for there to be integrated groups of Nassau. There were no women of color who were Nassau leaders. Occasionally Black women leaders like Mary Church Terrell would be invited, as Frederick Douglass too often spoke at Nassau conventions. So they would be invited to speak, but Mary Church Terrell would say things like, hey, white ladies, you are not taking the needs or insights of Black women seriously. What would happen if we worked together, in a truly meaningful way? And then they would basically say, thank you so much for coming, Mary Church Terrell. So not only was the suffrage movement segregated at the level of membership, it was also segregated at the level of leadership. So that's another way that race shapes the movement, and that the mainstream suffrage groups were primarily interested in attaining the vote for white women, not in some cases because of more overt racism, but more generally because of the realities of what it would entail to get a federal amendment passed. Because the white leaders of Nassau and the NWP, for example, knew that they would need some Southern support. So it wasn't necessarily that the white leaders of Nassau wanted to disenfranchise Black women in the South. It was that they wanted to appease these white Southern men. And actually, I shouldn't say Southern, because men in the Senate from all regions in both parties opposed the 19th Amendment because they didn't want to enfranchise Black women in the South. So that's the real kind of meat of this race story in the suffrage movement, is that the 19th Amendment only passes Congress not because anybody thinks it will enfranchise Black women in the South, but only because everyone knows it won't. And so we also need to tell these much broader, more nuanced stories of suffrage, and to look for the ways in which Black women contribute to the ongoing effort for universal rights, including Black women, but not limited to them, because they also wanted their husbands and sons and fathers and brothers to vote, to be able to vote. So to look for the ways in which Black women contribute to the suffrage movement, we have to look beyond suffrage to the Black women, the Black church, to groups like the National Association of Colored Women, and also the NAACP, where we see women all along fighting for voting rights. It just often wasn't called suffrage because those were the groups led by white women.
Thank you. That really helps, I think, share some of the nuance and some of the ways in which only lip service was given and nothing was followed through on for women of color, which we see, of course, throughout the past.
Mm-hmm.
So two of my favorite objects in CMC's new exhibition on the suffrage centennial are the voter rolls from Hamilton County from 1919 and 1920. And you can see this on our website at cincymuseum.org, where there's an online version of the exhibition. But you see the voter rolls for 1919 and then the voter rolls for 1920, which of course are fully twice as large. And it's amazing to see how in just 1 year, the voter population of Hamilton County in Ohio doubled. So, but of course, the 19th Amendment did not fully enfranchise everyone, even though it officially did. That was not necessarily the spirit of how it was enacted. So what happened next after ratification, after the amendment was officially ratified?
Okay, so many things. So not exactly what suffragists maybe hoped for, but the NAWSA, the main suffrage organization, became the League of Women Voters, and focused on advancing legislation such as the Shepherd-Towner Act, which until it was repealed a few years later, provided support for women and children. And then they also aimed, like they do today, to educate voters and increase civicism more broadly. So the League of Women Voters, led by Maud Park, is the NAWSA, what NAWSA becomes. The NWP, the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, turns its attention fully to the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment, which has also been in the news a lot lately, was seen as the sort of successor to the 19th Amendment. The thinking of the women in the NWP was that the vote was not enough. They counted more than 1,000 state laws that discriminated against women in various ways, including, what jobs women could apply for, what schools they could go to. So the NWP decided that rather than fight these state by state laws, better to have what they called a blanket amendment, sort of like what they did with the federal voting 19th Amendment, better to have an equality amendment that will just, make all these state-based laws void. So NWP turns to the Equal Rights Amendment, and African-American women continue to press to make the 19th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which had enfranchised Black men on paper, a reality. So they turn to fight for things like, again, the dire anti-lynching law, to fight lynching, and to fight for the enforcement of the 19th and 15th Amendments. So another theme I want to highlight today, and maybe we'll come back to it in the end when we get to thinking about today, is the difference between laws and enforcement. It's one thing to have a law on the books, right? It's another thing for it to be enforced. So my friend and colleague, another historian, she's a legal historian, Paula Monopoly, has a great new book coming out called Constitutional Orphan, where she's basically asking, why wasn't the 19th Amendment interpreted more broadly like the 14th? To really fundamentally revolutionize women's participation in society, women's participation in government. Why was it interpreted by the courts so narrowly? And what she argues in this great new book is that it's because no one paid attention to its enforcement. All the people who should have been, paying attention at the courts, lobbying the courts for its enforcement, the League of Women Voters, the NWP, turn their attention elsewhere. And they basically said, all we wanted was the vote. We don't care if it's enforced in the South, and a press for its larger meaning with regard to things like women serving on juries, representation of women in elective office. That's fine. We're moving on. So I think that's another missed opportunity of the 19th Amendment, is in these early years, there was not enough of a unified front to press for its interpretation in more broad terms. And so it was narrowly interpreted and not enforced in the South.
Fascinating. And as we're speaking, for those of you who are viewing, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we should have time to hit a couple of them here. There were so many colorful, interesting, inspiring characters involved in the fight for women's suffrage. And you've just published a terrific book, Freethinker, about one of them, Helen Hamilton Gardner. Could you tell us a little bit about Helen Hamilton Gardner?
Sure, I would love to. So I think that Helen Hamilton Gardner is the most fascinating and maybe even most important suffragist that no one's ever heard of. So Helen Hamilton Gardner was a fallen woman, meaning she had sex before marriage and people found out about it. And by people, I mean everyone in Ohio, because in Ohio, when she had an affair with a married man, and Ohio newspapers published the story because the man she had the affair with was an elected official. He was the commissioner of schools, and she had been working as a teacher.
Quel scandal.
Yeah, exactly. She actually graduated from the Cincinnati Normal School, which was the teacher training school on the West End. She graduated in 1873 and then moved to Sandusky, where she soon became the youngest principal in Ohio history. And then she comes to the attention of the Ohio Commissioner of Common Schools, Charles Smart. They have an affair. She's outed in the newspapers in 1876, run out of town, loses her job. But rather than slink away in shame, which was basically, the sort of the way this fallen woman story goes in the 19th century, you slink away in shame and then die a sad death. Gardner says no. Her name at the time, her birth name is Alice Chenoweth. So she says, that's not for me. I'm going to move to New York City. I'm going to change my name, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life dismantling the sexual double standard. So that really drew me to her story, her boldness, her bravery, her iconoclasm. She had hardly any role models. A major trope of 19th century literature is the fallen woman and how not to end up being the fallen woman. So Gardner rewrote this story, and she paved a new path for herself. So she changes her name, moves to New York City, and immediately enters the free thought lecture circuit, where she argues that the root cause of women's oppression, the root cause of the sexual double standard is in the Bible and the churches that promulgate its messages. Then she turns her attention to sex reform, and she enters the campaign led by the WCTU to raise the age of sexual consent for girls, which, believe it or not, was 12 or younger in 38 states in 1890. And in Delaware, it was 7. And this Delaware law, I just learned, was on the books until 1972.
Oh my goodness.
Even though so many women recognized this was wrong and abhorrent, few were bold enough to talk about it because it was such a taboo to say words like sex or talk about rape. So Gardner really breaks with convention. In her bold writing, she publishes novels, trying to garner sympathy for the fallen women, to show what it's like from the fallen woman's perspective. For these efforts, she becomes known as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen woman. So I really think her story is instructive here because it shows us that the 19th Amendment, that the women's suffrage movement was always at heart, at least in part, about the right to one's own body. And here I'm not necessarily saying birth control. I know that's a more modern way we think about this, but a right to say no to your husband, right to control what happens to your own body. Women in the 19th century called it the right to self-ownership. So that's what Gardner is talking about. An end to the sexual double standard, an end to boys will be boys looking the other way while men do all sorts of, crimes against women. She wanted that to end. And she, like many of her colleagues, believed that the vote was one way to make it so. So the other thing that drew me to Gardner's story, and that I think is so instructive for today, is she becomes the most potent factor in congressional passage of the 19th Amendment. So she reinvents once more in the early 20th century. She marries a revered Civil War hero from Chillicothe, and they moved together to Washington, D.C. in 1910, where many factors converge to make her Nassau's lead negotiator in Washington. One factor is Gardner herself. She's so charming. She's so savvy. She writes a heck of a letter. So she's really smart in negotiating. And the second thing is she lives next door to the Speaker of the House, and she works that really well to convey information, to get information, to ask for favors. The third thing is her husband, the Civil War hero. His address book is chock full of all of his Civil War veteran buddies, both Union and Confederate. He had fought for the Union, but one of his jobs at the conclusion of the war was to guard the cell of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And because he had been kind to Jefferson Davis, according to the widow, Verena, she wrote about it in her memoir, Confederates really liked him too. So in Washington in 1912, 1915, 1919, that's who's in charge, right? The Civil War, it's Civil War veterans, their sons, their nephews. These stories of the Civil War are still so salient in determining who has power. So Gardner utilizes this vast network to the suffragists' advantage. She provides them the insider link they had long sought but never had. So she becomes, her colleagues call her, as I mentioned, the most potent factor in congressional passage. And then she also converts President Wilson to the cause. She becomes a welcome daily presence at the Wilson White House, if you can believe that. She's there all the time. He sends her drafts, memos. While they're still, the ink is still wet, she corrects them. She sends him even bulleted to-do lists of what he can do to help get the 19th Amendment through Congress. It was Gardner, in fact, who convinced President Wilson to demand that the governor of Tennessee call a special ratification session in August, which is how it came to be that Tennessee ratified, became the 36th state to ratify 100 years ago today, because Gardner got the president to get the governor to call a special session. So, and then President Wilson appointed her as the highest ranking woman in federal government as a civil service commissioner, which is just underneath the rank of cabinet secretary. So she becomes a national symbol, front page headlines across the country of what it means finally for white women, at least, to be full citizens. So through her story, we can really see the whole of the women's rights movement that culminates in the vote. So that's why I thought it was so important to tell her story and to talk about her story. It centers sex, it centers race and racism, and it also reminds us of the importance of historical narratives. Whose stories do we tell? Whose do we forget? And what does this mean about us as a nation?
That's fascinating. Gosh, I wish I could meet her. She sounds like a really amazing person. Yeah. She sounds like a really colorful character and a really successful and inspiring character in many ways. Who are a few other women in suffrage history that you think we ought to know?
That's a great question. And I also am going to steer you to a couple new books coming out, because in addition to Free Thinker, we're so lucky in 2020 to see so many great new books that are really revolutionizing the way we understand suffrage and the women's rights movement. So one is a woman named Zitkala Saw, or Gertrude Bonham. She was a Native American woman who not only campaigned for suffrage, but also for Native American citizenship, which became a reality in 1924. So another group of women who were not technically enfranchised by the 19th Amendment in 1920 were Native American women who, along with Native American men, were not considered citizens until 1924. My colleague Kathleen Cahill had an interview in the New York Times, which you can Google and read, talking about Gertrude Bonham and some other Native American women in their fight for suffrage. And Kathleen Cahill has a great new book coming out called Recasting the Vote, which describes the suffrage activism of a variety of women, from Native American women to African American women, Chinese American women, and Hispanic women. I also really hope that the suffrage centennial will center the stories of Black women who, as I mentioned earlier, because of the organization of the main suffrage groups, have for far too long been really left out of the story, when in fact they're so central. So I hope the suffrage centennial makes us all more familiar with women like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was an abolitionist, a women's rights activist, a suffragist, and one of the founders of the NAACP. And it was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper who spoke so passionately at the 1869 convention in Cleveland, where the Universal Suffrage Coalition was debating whether or not to support the 15th Amendment. And she was speaking passionately about this sort of breakdown in discussions. And she urged everyone to remember that we are all bound up in this together, she said. So I hope that we remember the stories of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and her push for universal voting rights, universal suffrage. I also hope we remember and learn more about Mary Church Terrell, who also was one of the founders of the NAACP and of the National Association of Colored Women, and its first president. And she also has Ohio connections because she studied at Oberlin, which was such an important training ground for abolitionists and women's rights activists. I also hope that we learn more about Mary Ware Dennett. Mary Ware Dennett was the corresponding secretary for NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, in the teens. So she devoted many years of her life to suffrage. But then she had a falling out with suffrage leadership for many reasons that I won't get into here, but she resigns, and then she turns her full attention to birth control. So again, illustrating these close links between the origins of the suffrage movement and the demands for bodily autonomy, right? They're two sides of the same coin, I think. So Mary Ware Dennett goes on to found the American Birth Control League. Another colleague of mine, Lauren McIver Thompson, has a new book coming out about Mary Ware Dennett, and also Margaret Sanger, her rival. Speaking of rivalries, because Margaret Sanger also is instrumental in these early years of birth control, but she has a rivalry with Mary Ware Dennett that shapes how the birth control movement develops as well. So those are just some of the women I hope we learn more about, and some of the new books coming out that I hope we will look for.
That's great. And I see a question from Amy on, will we get links to some of these books? Yes, I can send that out.
Sure.
The broadcast, links to some of these awesome resources that sound like great opportunities of learning more than before.
Yeah.
Well, we've referenced, today and what we can learn from history a few times. We know from recent headlines that the 19th Amendment and even the Civil Rights Movement didn't solve all the issues related to voter access and voter rights. What can we learn from women's fight for the vote that can add some context to some of the struggles we see today?
I think it's so important to think about the 19th Amendment centennial in terms of ongoing struggles for voting rights. So I think there's many lessons. The first, I think, is that we need to understand the 19th Amendment as the twin amendment of the 15th, right? As I mentioned earlier, they were born of the same impetus, and they were both born in this sort of initial universal suffrage coalition, that the original goal, and the goal I think we're still fighting for, is universal suffrage for all, not this sort of piecemeal access that we have now, where the laws basically say you can't discriminate based on this, and now you can't discriminate based on this, but we don't have the positive affirmation that citizenship equals voting rights. That was the initial goal. I think we need to remember that. I think the suffrage movement reminds us of that. I also hope the suffrage centennial and these broader conversations we're having remind us of the extent to which white legislators have gone, and to my mind, continue to go, to disenfranchise people of color. So I was watching how the 19th Amendment got through Congress. I was so shocked, because if you look at the correspondence that Helen Hamilton Gardner, HHG, had with members of Congress as the suffragist lead negotiator, if you look at the congressional record to see what congressmen said on the floor as the 19th Amendment was circulating in 1918, 1919, all they talk about is the 15th Amendment. No one says women shouldn't vote because it will destroy the family. No one says women shouldn't vote because they're not smart enough. These were kind of earlier 19th century objections. But by 1918, 1919, you can't logically make those claims anymore. The only thing legislators are saying is that they're afraid the 19th Amendment will enfranchise Black women, especially in southern states where the Black population in some cases outnumbers the whites. But also, they are afraid that the 19th Amendment will compel the federal government to enforce its twin, the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment had been on the books, obviously, since 1870, but it hadn't been enforced since 1877. So in the aftermath of the Compromise of 1877, Black men had effectually been disenfranchised throughout the South through a variety of legal and extra-legal measures. Everyone knew this, but the congressmen were afraid that the 19th Amendment would bring more attention to the 15th and compel the federal government to actually enforce it for once. And one of the most powerful discussions of this I saw came from William Borah, the Lion of Idaho, Republican of Idaho, and Cincinnati fun fact, the father of Alice Roosevelt Longworth's only child. So you may think she had a baby with her husband, Cincinnati and Nick Longworth, but no, the father of her baby was actually William Borah.
Interesting.
a big secret at the time. But anyway, Bora lived in Idaho, where women had had the franchise since the 19th century, along with in several other Western states. That was also the case. So suffragists thought he was their ally, but he refused to vote yes on the 19th Amendment because he didn't want there to be a Black woman voting in the South. And also, and this is the part that really got me, he said, you know what? You're asking me to write into law another lie. He said, we have sat here in Congress and sat still for 40 years while African-American men are disenfranchised throughout the South. We have sat here and not done, anything about the 15th Amendment. And now basically you're asking us to write into law another fundamental lie so that we can sit still and do nothing for another 40 years. And so that's why he said he wouldn't vote no. And that's pretty much exactly what happened, right? It wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act that the 15th and the 19th Amendments became reality for all. And now to bring us back to today, which was the impetus of your question, in 2013, Shelby v. Holder dismantled key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the key enforcement provisions about which counties and which states need to still abide by the Voting Rights Act, right? So here we get to my main point, which is it's not enough to have a law on the books. We also have to have a law that is enforced. We also have to have voting access. So in 2020, we have two related problems. One is of enforcement, right? We may have voting rights on paper, but are they enforced? And the second is access. Can voters access the polls? Will we have a post office by November to deliver our mail-in ballots? Are there precincts in every district? Are there precincts that are staffed? Do you have to wait 6 hours to vote? Why do we not have, a federal holiday for voting? Why do we not have, immediate voter registration? Why do we make it so hard to vote when we could make it so easy? And when so many other countries have shown us the way in this. So that's, I hope, some of the conversations that will be inspired by the suffrage centennial and the 150th anniversary of the 15th.
Excellent. And we do have a question that came in through the Ask a Question button. The ERA was just approved by Virginia in January 2020 as the 38th state to ratify. What is happening for women in the other 12 states left to seek ratification? That's from Debbie Niehaus.
Oh, hi, Debbie. Thank you for that question. So I don't know that much about what's happening for women in the other 12 states, but I can speak to what's happening, federally about the ERA. So in some of my talks, I have this graphic of, which states have ratified the ERA and when. And if you want to email me, I can share that with you too, but you probably have seen it. So basically the questions are, do states that ratified, like states like Virginia and Illinois that ratified after the congressionally imposed ERA deadline, do they still count? And then what about the states that ratified and then later rescinded? Do they count? So what we need now is the legislation that the House passed earlier this year to sort of null and void the time clock and say these later ratifications do still count. So the House passed that, but the Senate obviously has not, and under its current configuration is very unlikely to even take it up. So I've published, and I can share some articles about the Equal Rights Amendment, its broader history, and also what it might mean and what it might not mean, right? So we also should think about how is equality legislated? How is it enforced? What role do families play in this, right? One of the things I often say is equality begins at home. So I hope that we also have these broader discussions, which the pandemic is highlighting so much, about domestic labor, who does domestic labor, who do we employ to do domestic labor, what are their benefits in heterosexual households, how are they divided by sex, what lessons are our children learning? The pandemic has really highlighted the inequities that many of our households still function under, right? And I think that's just replicated the higher up the chain we go. Sometimes I joke that we don't have more women in office because, we're too busy, even if we work full time, like making lists in our head about what we need at Target or whose soccer registration has to be filled out to do things like run for office, right? And so study after study has shown that even in well-meaning households, right, women still perform 70% or more of the domestic labor and childcare. will the ERA fix that? I don't know. Like, what else can we do to fix that? Not that I'm not for the ERA, I'm totally for the ERA, but I also want this to be a chance for us to think, what else can we do? Where else in our systems, in our structures, in our institutions, can we find inequality and hopefully root it out?
That's great. We started this conversation with a comment about the histories that are taught and are not taught. So thinking in that sort of practical vein, if you have hopes for the changing of the teaching of history and how that might shift, what might they be? And likewise, for the parents or caregivers or aunties and grandmas in our audience, what questions can we ask of our own kids' history curriculum in an effort to make sure that we're broadening the kinds of stories that we learn?
This is a great question. And I think that National Women's History Museum Foundation report that I referenced earlier has some great tips, practical guidelines for how we can revise our history textbooks and our state-based standards, because generally the textbooks respond to the state standards. So you may have also seen earlier this year, the New York Times published that disturbing article about how different histories are taught based on what the state textbooks say. So it was basically a comparison of Texas and California, I think, and how fundamentally different worlds students learn about just based on these various state standards. So I think we also need to pay a lot more attention to who's on our state school boards, who's making these decisions about state standards, about textbooks. So that's at the sort of foundational, structural, institutional level. But I think you're also asking, like, what can we do in our homes until we get to these more fundamental changes? And there, I think we're lucky in that there's so many great resources, so many great books. The Museum Center's new exhibition on women's suffrage, right? We can really pick and choose what we highlight for our children. So my 7-year-old loves the New York Times Who Was series. The first chapter book he ever read was Who Was Sally Ride? And then he's like, Mom, can boys be astronauts?
That's amazing.
Sometimes they can. And then he became obsessed with Frederick Douglass. And in his first grade class last year, they all had to do a presentation on a great American. And he was so bummed that he got Alexander Hamilton, which of course every other kid wanted because of the musical. But my son was like, I really wanted Frederick Douglass. And it's like, because he reads these books, right? And so Frederick Douglass may not have gotten center stage in first grade, but Frederick Douglass has center stage in our house. So anyway, I think the museums that we go to, the books we choose make a huge difference until we can have a more success in changing state standards and textbooks.
Nice. You know, as we're talking about legislation and education efforts and those kinds of things, it strikes me that there is one, probably not a final frontier, but a big frontier in politics for women, which is having a woman in the White House as head of our country. Yes. So this might be an unfair question, but do you think in our lifetimes we will be able to see that? And what holds us back as a culture from that last big hurdle of having a woman executive in the White House?
Yes. So this is another thing I think and write a lot about. So I'm on the Ohio Humanities Speakers Bureau. And so one of my talks is women running for president. And I've written a lot about it too, and some essays in the Washington Post if you want to go. So there's a variety of things that hold us back. One, as I mentioned earlier, is I think popular culture, like our visions of what it means to be a leader. And this is why I think the history we tell is so important, because it shapes what we think is possible moving forward. So if we don't have visions of female leaders, if we don't know about all the brave, bold women leaders of the past, we're less likely to imagine women in leadership positions today. So that's why I'm so passionate about women's history and why I want us to know the names of so many more women, because it's not like these inspiring stories don't exist. We just don't know them. And I think there's a direct correlation to women in politics today. So one is this level of stories and narratives. Two, I think, is this issue of time, right? How women are socialized, what our day-to-day lives are. I think we need to have many more robust conversations about childcare, about the distribution of domestic labor, to make to enable more women to run for office. So for example, I recently did an interview with this group in Oregon, which I'd never heard of, which sounds awesome though. They're called Politicit. So this was started by a mom in Oregon. And what she does is she gets grant funding and raises money for parents, not just women, but parents who want to attend school board meetings, go vote, run for office. So she provides childcare for people to be civically engaged. What a great idea, right? So we need more structural support, I think, for working parents, especially women, is another reason. And then third, I think, and this is not going to come as a surprise to any of you, probably, I'm guessing many of you are members of groups like League of Women Voters or YWCA, where we need to really work for universal voting rights, to redistrict, to end gerrymandering, and for campaign finance reform. I think there are so many barriers in place between what, citizens want and the leaders that we get, right? There's not a one-to-one anymore of who we want to vote for to elect us and who we get in office because of these various structural barriers. So I think to get more women, more people of color in office, our votes need to be, I don't want to say more, it's not that they're not counted, but they don't count for what we want them to count for. And we don't have the access to legislators that we need and want because of gerrymandering and the over influence of money in political elections. To benefit women running for office and attaining even the presidency. May it be so soon.
Yes. And local shout out to the Women's Funds Appointed Project, which if anybody listening has political aspirations, the Appointed Project at the Women's Fund of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation looks specifically at appointments to public boards, which turn out to be something of a boys' club and helping women gain the skills necessary to be on board or hold other political office. We talked a bit about Helen Hamilton Gardner and what an amazing woman she was. If you think of her, if she were, a member of our society today, looking at the political scene, looking at some of the advances that women have made, looking at some of the ways in which women still have far to go, what do you think she'd think? What do you think she'd be urging us to do?
Well, two things. One, I think she'd be surprised that the sexual double standard is still so fierce. I've been writing a lot of things this week about it, and what I've started calling it patriarchy's last best tool. I don't know for what reason among all of the tools of patriarchy, I don't know how it has come to be that the sexual double standard, I think, is the hardest one to root out. And I think she would be surprised that despite all of our, educational gains and gains in various arenas, changes in marriage, that to see the hold that the sexual double standard still has, and how we evaluate women and what we condone among men, among our male leaders, and what we sort of brush off as, again, still boys will be boys. I think she would be shocked to see that. That would be number one. The second thing, and I've already sort of mentioned this, so I'll be brief, but to her, having access to her congressional representatives, having the people know what was going on in Congress was so important. So just to give one quick example, the first thing she did, the way she became Nassau's most efficient Washington volunteer in 1912, is she would go to Congress because she lived nearby. She'd take the streetcar, and whenever suffrage was being discussed by anyone, she would sit there, and then she would call up the office and say, "Oh, I really liked Representative Thomas's speech today on suffrage. I would like to get a bunch of copies. Can I have some? And then I would like your office to frank, the congressional privilege of mailing for free, copies of this speech to members of my women's suffrage group across the country." And they all did. So in this way, she was kind of being strategic because it got suffragists across the country to think of her when they thought of Washington, right? She's the one who sent the speeches, but she was also showing Congress is a place for you, right? You can see what congressmen at this time, with the brief exception of Jeanette Rankin, it was all men, who's saying, you can see what congressmen are saying, and they care what you think. You should write them. You should come visit them. And now I feel like we're so many levels removed. I mean, when was the last time you went to, the Senate chamber to listen to a debate? When was the last time you thought to request a transcript? So I think Gardner would be really surprised at the many levels of disconnect now between people and our elected officials. And I'm not saying that's on us as citizens. In part, I think it is, but it's also part of these barriers that have been enacted through, curtailing voting rights, through gerrymandering, through redistricting, through campaign finance, where congressional leaders, members of Congress, no longer have to really be answerable to citizens if they are kept in office by outside money. So I think she would be shocked by that as well.
We have just a few more minutes, and so if there's anyone else that has any other questions, please chime in. But wanted to just sort of open the floor one more time to ask, is there anything else that you want to make sure our audience knows about the history of women's suffrage, or Ratification Day, or Helen Hamilton Gardner, or anything else?
The takeaway message I hope people get from the suffrage centennial is that women's suffrage was a vibrant, multifaceted, fascinating movement populated by bold and brave women, many of whose stories have yet to be unearthed, have yet to be told. So I hope that this generates a lot more enthusiasm. I hope that we can begin to dispense with and deconstruct this idea that suffrage is somehow boring and it's, a tangential part of our national history, and instead understand that it's very foundational to who we are as a country, past, present, and future. So I hope that we'll see so many more books, a changing in our textbooks, and also I know there's going to be several new, documentaries and movies in the works to help bring these stories not just to readers but to the big screen and change the stories that we tell about ourselves, because I think that will also change who we are in the future, especially in positions of power.
Perfect. Excellent. Everything you said as a museum person and as a writer really speaks to me in the way that you're thinking about stories. So thank you for that. I want to thank Dr. Kimberly Hamlin for being a really amazing guest on our Q&A today. And a couple thoughts in closing. First, Kimberly, thank you so much for your time. And viewers, thank you for your great questions and for being with us today. I want to remind you of two resources for you if you'd like to learn more about the fight for women's suffrage. First is the free exhibition, An Unfinished Revolution, Women and the Vote, that just opened at Museum Center. And also Dr. Hamlin's book, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, which is available now. We'll be hosting future Q&As on the suffrage movement, so stay tuned for next month's interview with feminist historian Catherine Burak, who helped curate CMC's exhibit. And finally, I'll leave you with a quote from one of Ohio's own, Victoria Woodhull, which seems appropriate today. If Congress refused to listen to and grant what women ask, there is but one course left then to pursue. What is there left for women to do? To become the mothers of the future government. So let that be our charge as we go off today. Happy Ratification Day, everyone. Thank you so much, Kimberly, and everyone have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you so much.